So I'm just briefly going to introduce, waiting for people to come in. We're running a tight schedule here. So our next session is on synthetic fuels made from, well, ultimately carbon dioxide and water. And Vikram from the Research Triangle Institute will lead and moderate this discussion. So if I could ask the panel to come to the podium, and we'll listen and hear what's coming up.
So good morning, and thank you, Klaus and Alissa, for taking the risk of having me moderate this. You may reassess your decision at some other later point. And thank you, Christoph, for helping herd the cats here. Thank you. So what we're going to speak to, as Klaus said, is synthetic fuels, although this will have a particular focus. But let me just make a couple of remarks. One is, I think, as was pointed out earlier, greenhouse gas mitigation is no longer in doubt. Even the doubters are not in doubt anymore, I think. But while we think of only CO2, I'm going to put a plug in for fugitive methane as well, because fugitive methane, as we all know, is 21 times worse, and there's a fair bit of it. The part that is oil and gas related will from 2015 onwards get flared if the EPA doesn't get cold feet and give holidays to everybody. Will not be allowed to be flared after 2015. So, but when you flare it, you get CO2, so you're back to at least a CO2 problem. But there are two other sources which still continue to be pernicious. One is waste, and we just discussed how energy from waste can happen. The other is agriculture, basically ruminants. And you know, I sometimes like to say an outbreak of vegetarianism may be the best thing for the environment that we can have, but probably unlikely to happen. But the beneficial conversion of both is something that folks like me encourage. Although this is going to be primarily a CO2 discussion, they both share one characteristic. It didn't used to be the case, but when shale gas happened, that characteristic came to hydrocarbons as well, which is they're highly distributed. So shale gas, unlike conventional hydrocarbons, is very distributed. So distributed raw material leads to a desire for distributed production. And you will be hearing some about that on the CO2 side. Now, on the CO2 side, it is also distributed industrially. And in the air, it's not so much distributed, but it is very dilute. So either dilute or distributed, you have a different issue, and therefore it becomes a technical problem. You know, I was on a panel recently where one of the panelists said that beneficial conversion of CO2 is such a small factor, it's not worth bothering with. And you know, there is a lot of that stuff that goes on. I personally say if you don't start, then you don't get anywhere. And the other thing I say is that only the Lone Ranger believed in silver bullets, so we don't. So what we have is a challenge, and that challenge is the small concentrations or the small accumulations. To me, methanol is the best target fuel, partly because despite what was said earlier, it's tricky, everything is tricky, but methanol is the simplest molecule you can make, which is a fuel substitute. And the Chinese are taking the lead in this on gasoline substitution. We should learn from that. And the other is that an entire technology needs to be developed on small footprint production of these things. There'll be a little mention of that, but I will press my panelists on that point. And the reason for the small footprint is I just told you. The raw material, if you will, is distributed, and therefore your production needs to be distributed, which means that all of us have to take our sophomore engineering, economies of scale ideas somewhere and say, how do we explain that? How do we get around that? So there it is. So with that, I will now give you my panelists. You can read their bios, but we will do this in this order. So the Christian with Sunfire will lead it off, and then followed by Søren Ebbehøj from the Technical University of Denmark. And then finally, it'll be Bøgild Hansen from Haldor Topsøe from Denmark also. So let's get on with it. Thank you. 15 minutes. 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
There's a timekeeper over there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Vikram, for the kind introduction, and thanks, Klaus and Morgans, for the kind invitation. Very happy to be here. First time I was here was 4 years ago. We were 3 people at Sunfire at that time, and I felt a bit ridiculous, frankly. Today we are 70 people, and we are working in fuel cells, we are working in electrolyzers, and we are working in conversion technology to convert CO2 plus hydrogen into fuels. Let me move on with my talk and explain you furthermore what our current focus is. I want to talk about the status of our SOEC development and the Fuel 1 PTL test plant. I want to share some cost estimations, but I especially want to talk about small-scale PTX units and a change in strategy that we will probably have to do within our company in order to earn money in this market. We talked about the commercial challenges already earlier today. The SOEC, most of you are familiar with it, I will keep it short, is a steam electrolyzer that converts steam into hydrogen. And this is always the start, like in any photosynthesis plant, to produce fuels that come at the end of the process chain. If you combine CO2 with hydrogen, you will produce syngas, and then via a synthesis produce CH2, which stands for any kind of hydrocarbon, whether it's methanol or fossil crude oil, doesn't matter. The synthesis is always exothermic. So you will always lose energy here that you have used to turn liquid water into hydrogen if you cannot use this off-heat to produce steam. If you can produce steam, you will be able to apply the SOEC, which then takes steam to produce hydrogen and not liquid water, and thereby save 16% of energy in the very beginning of the process, and 16% of energy efficiency increase in an energetic process is tremendous. Some of you may work in the refinery. If you get 0.5% more efficiency in a refinery, you will be a millionaire. So 16% more efficiency is good. And this is why we work in many institutes and companies worldwide on the steam electrolyzer. We're currently having a project, also sponsored by the BMBF, the German Ministry for R&D, and we have 2 main work packages. We have some more, but I want to emphasize on those 2. The work package A is steam electrolysis, and the work package B is then take the hydrogen from the steam electrolyzer together with CO2 and turn it into hydrocarbons. Where are we at the steam electrolyzer? This is important. Our goal was to create a stack generation that has less than 1% degradation per 1,000 hours, that can be run in a reversible mode. So on the one hand side, produce hydrogen. Once energy is there, it needs to be stored. But on the other side, also take hydrogen or hydrocarbons and turn them back into electricity once this is required. And that can modulate flexibly according to the energy input from renewable sources. We also want to scale it towards 5 to 10 kilowatt, and we want to run it on a pressurized level. And here we are regarding our development. The degradation is currently at 0.7% per 1,000 hours. That is really a very encouraging result. When we started 15 months ago, our degradation was 5.6% per 1,000 hours. So this is really good. And this is also at a commercially sufficient power density. I don't want to bore you with details here, but this is driven commercially. The second thing is it is a robust cell and stack that can be run reversibly between SOFC and SOEC. And the third thing that we have shown already is that we can modulate between from maximum to 0 to maximum power within 30 minutes. And we will now do some tests towards 15 minutes, 5 minutes, and eventually, hopefully, 30 seconds. I have not convinced my people yet to do it, but I will do it in the end. And this is really a major step currently towards the industrialization of steam electrolysis. Steam electrolysis always has the reputation of not being industrially viable. We hope that this will change within the next month. These results are brand new, and we are currently publishing them in Germany and Europe. Now this is our next step, which we have not done yet. We will scale the stack to around 10 kilowatt unit It can also be a bit bigger, but 10 kilowatt is already a scale which is nice. And we'll do it under pressurized operation. What you see here is the test bench developing a pressurized operation at 850 degrees Celsius. 30 bars is not so easy, so we did some pre-tests here. This was work package A. Work package B is the current status of our Fuel 1 test plant. This was the plan, and now it's becoming real. This was status in February this year. It's 40 meters high, 40 meters wide, and 8 meters deep here. It will produce 1 barrel of synthetic hydrocarbons per day, so 159 liters. And it will start up in the 3rd quarter of 2014. Currently, the process components are installed, and we are sort of filling the contents. It's going on quite well. I want to show you some pictures. This is our reverse water gas shift reactor, 3 meters high. Some of you know what this is important for. This is our Fischer-Tropsch reactor, 8 meters high and about that diameter. So it's a real Fischer-Tropsch reactor. It's not a lab scale anymore. This is our steam drum, which takes the exothermic heat from the Fischer-Tropsch generator and provides it then to the electrolyzer so that we can use the steam instead of liquid water and thereby save the energy, which I explained in my introduction. And this is the distillation column. Now, we talked about the commercial viability of energy storage via liquid fuels, PTL, power to gas, whatever. Here I show you some cost estimation for the megawatt scale. And the problem is that if you do such a plant that you have seen here, if you build such a plant, you will not be able to go below something like 5 million euros because you have certain installations, the number of tubes is the same, the number of valves is the same, the controls are the same, and so on. So even if you produce just 1 liter of fuel per day with this kind of plant, I'm saying with this kind of plant that can really provide a high quality fuel, you will probably not end up below 5 million euros. So you will have to get a certain scale in order to get to a positive IRR. And we guess currently that 10 megawatts would be something that we could provide to run at a positive IRR. But there are regulative risks which I want to emphasize on later. So it's a risky business model because it depends on government regulations, and no investor will believe that the government will keep up those regulations for 20 years. Let's get away from the technology. What is the strategic problem for storage technologies and business models currently? The Energiewende in Germany, which is the conversion of the energy sector from the fossil to the renewable sources, needs storage capacity to ensure 2 things. The first one is security of supply. Of course, you need a seasonal storage. But the secondly is grid stability, mainly for mid and low voltage grids. And in the old days, it was like this. Here we have a fossil power plant. It delivers high voltage energy. This is distributed via the high voltage grid, and via the mid and low voltage grid, it's distributed to the consumer. In the new Energiewende scenario, it's different. The consumer becomes a prosumer. He also produces small-scale energy. He feeds energy into the grid, and this energy then needs to be distributed via the grid to other prosumers. The problem is that those grids are not large enough to cope with the energy feed in, and so there we have bottlenecks within our system. And therefore, we need a compensation load and can store via power to gas or power to liquid. The problem is that these plants that we need in our grid are not 10 megawatts, 20 megawatts. They are more something like 30 to 500 kilowatt units. This is currently our best guess, which is to be confirmed. We're currently undergoing a study. I'm talking about this here, so please don't challenge me too much on where this number comes from, but whether it's 30 to 500 or 500 to 2 megawatts, it doesn't make a big difference. The economies of scale is not there, according to what I showed to you earlier. But this is not the biggest problem. We could do engineering. We can produce those small units on big scale and reduce their cost. This would be possible. Very, very big thing, whether it's a small or a big unit, is it hardly operates beyond 2,000 hours per year in a storage mode, because you don't have that much surplus energy in the grid, and not for the next 5 or 10 years. There are many, many simulations out there. I can recommend some literature if someone of you is interested in this. But we cannot, even if we went to 3,000 hours per year, that would be the absolute maximum. And this leads to a high capex per kilowatt hour of stored energy. And this is what kills every business model of energy storage. Therefore, the government says, okay, now we need to put some regulative incentives in order to get this thing going. They want to introduce a super credit in the EU, and they really have great sympathy for this kind of technology. But even although we are the ones who would benefit from this kind of regulation, we say this is something that will not help us in the long run, and probably also not in the short run, because no commercial investor will believe that those super credits will last for another 10, 15 years, which would be required. And therefore, we currently don't see any commercial investment into such storage projects. And it doesn't help to do pilots all the time, because pilots will not earn the money in order to run companies that produce storage technologies. So what does a commercially attractive storage business model look like? We need to increase our capacity utilization. And the only chance to do that is quite logic, and the idea is not new, but we as Sunfire have made, or are about to make it, the decision to move towards this. This is really brand new. We need to run our plants in a reverse mode, meaning that once storage is required, we will store energy. Once energy is required, because there's not enough energy that could be stored, we will have to produce energy with the same plant in a decentralized mode on small scale. And because our SOEC, SOFC stack works reversibly, this is possible. And the first calculations really show that this is the best way to approach this storage commercial model challenge. So the concept of reversible solid oxide fuel cell, you could also call it PTX, TP, power to something to power, is if you have such a unit and you connect it to the grid, you can store energy whenever you like, and once it's best to do it commercially, and you can take energy from the grid and produce energy once it's required. And compared to any battery or accumulator, this system would not be forced to store the same amount of money that it later turns back into energy. It can produce, it can store energy at maybe 20% of the time, feed it into the natural gas grid, and take out energy at 70% of the time. This is possible because it's connected to a larger global grid. The second thing which helps this business model is that power to X, power to liquids or power to gas, can supply a different market. For example, the biofuel market. We were hearing about the RINs earlier. In Germany, it's called the biofuel certificate, which create an extra willingness to pay for such biofuels. You can feed everything you store virtually into this market and gain extra revenues. On the other hand, you can take, once you need to produce electric energy, you can just take the fossil gas from the grid and thereby decrease the cost for the fuel input. The third advantage of this model is that power to gas, power to liquids, will produce a high quality fuel versus the fuel cell that provides power can use low quality fuels. And thereby you can optimize your cost or revenue relation. And those various degrees of freedom will help us to decrease the risk for the investors, because under changing regulations, they can still focus, they can always change their mode of operation from SOFC to SOEC and back, and they can change the fuel they use, they can change the market that they sell the produced or stored fuel into, and so on and so on. So from the first response that we got from investors, this is a far better business model than any pure storage unit. I have to say that here. I know this may raise some questions. I'm looking forward to the discussion. But we from Sunfire believe that in the next 5 years, we'll probably not be able to sell large power storage plants if we are not able to run them reversibly. Maybe we find the investor to build it. We will be happy to build it. But currently, we have not been successful yet. I'm done. And the other thing is it will be a decentral lateral power storage and supply unit, which is strategic for the Energiewende. So I heard it earlier. Let's make it real, and thanks for your attention.
Okay, so this is going to be a slightly more technical presentation. How does this? Yeah. Okay, you've seen various versions of this figure before. We just heard about doing steam electrolysis and then reacting with CO2 afterwards. The vision for the project that I'm working on is capturing CO2 from the atmosphere, as we heard before, and then doing co-electrolysis. So you feed both the steam and the CO2 into an electrolyzer cell, and then after that produce fuel. Now, in a sort of conceptual model of what such a system could look like, we have the air capture part. Then there is going to be a purification step and a pressurization step before we reach the electrolyzer stack. And those are the two focal areas of my project, and also what I'm going to talk about here. Just a little bit about solid oxide electrolyzer cells. If you look at the figure on your right, that's a half shell consisting of the electrode where the electrolysis reaction takes place. And as you can see, the blue phase is a ceramic backbone that conducts oxygen ions. The green phase is the electrocatalyst, that's nickel. And then the white background is a porous phase. So we have, where these three phases meet, we have the three-phase boundary, and this is the catalytically active site. I'm telling you this because this is one of the main areas where impurities in the reactant gases sits, reacts, and forms glassy phases that can block these sites. Also, the nickel surface is active in the process, and various chemical species will absorb on the nickel surface and block that. And finally, we can have deposition of carbon and others that can block the porous phase. On your left, you have a figure showing a cell voltage over time and at a constant current. And as the cell is poisoned, in this case it's by hydrogen sulfide, you see on the black curve that the cell voltage rises as the surface is blocked. And this experiment was done for concentrations of hydrogen sulfide down to 5 ppb. So that's very, very low levels of impurities that are problematic for electrolyzer cells. In order to test this, and this is kind of difficult with conventional gas analysis equipment, we built a setup where we absorb impurities in the gas stream from various air capture technologies. We absorb them on crushed electrode material. So we basically take the electrode where the impurities would sit and poison it. We crush it and use that as a filter. You can do that for protecting the cells, and in this case we did it for capturing the impurities, and then we could do elemental analysis on that afterwards. I looked at two different systems. One is being investigated by a company in Switzerland called Climeworks, and the other one is investigated here by Klaus and his co-workers. So the results from that, looking at the filter material that comes out with various different techniques. The most important one is the one that's called glow discharge mass spectrometry. That's a technique when you basically vaporize the sample and look at what comes off. We tested for 25 different elements in the sample, and as you can see in the table, there are a lot of different impurities still, or left in the filter. This is ppm by molar in the gas stream. So these levels are quite high compared to what you saw before, which was the 5 ppb. So there's definitely a concern here if you want to use air captured CO2 in at least solid oxide electrolyzer cells. On your right, that's an electron microscope image showing part of the filter also, and you can see the sort of gooey stuff that sits on those wires is that's deposited carbon. So there is a carbon deposition thing going on as well. That is usually not a problem in electrolyzer cells because there will be a lot of water there which suppresses the carbon formation process. But to take what is to take home from this slide, I think sits up here. Yeah, there are various trace elements present in low concentrations. They are also known to be detrimental to durability of solid oxide cells, but they're in low concentrations. Sources from them could be various machine parts in the setups. It could be contaminants in the sorbent materials. It could actually be captured from the atmosphere. Here in New York City, various kinds of sulfurous components could be envisioned to actually be captured, and I think we know that that is going on. But we assume that these are preventable, or at least we can minimize them by carefully selecting the materials for the systems. And also they can be filtered out. And we know that activated carbon filters takes out some of this, but also we can use the filters that we used in this analysis to take it out. And with the current sort of layout of those filters, we need around 8 tons per 1,000 tons of CO2. That's a lot. That could probably be lowered by, I would guess, a factor of 10 maybe. But also these filters can easily be regenerated by flowing air through them, oxidizing the nickel, and then you'll get rid of most of the impurities, and you can reduce them again and use them again. And that could be done in situ, so that should be fairly cheap. Okay, moving on to the compression of CO2 or the pressurization. This is a model that I'm working on, and yeah, it looks like the one you saw before. You have the CO2 and the water in inlet streams on your left, and then it produces synthesis gas. So that's where I sort of cut the model. There are various strategies for pressurizing this CO2. This is the phase diagram of CO2. So you have the temperature on the x-axis, and you have the pressure up here. That's a logarithmic scale. And what you see over there, that's ambient conditions. So that's where we start with the CO2. One thing to do is to compress it directly to 5 bar here and then heat it up. So that was one case I looked at. The other one was pressurization and then cooling down to liquid CO2, followed by evaporating it at higher pressure, or you could cool it straight away to solid CO2 and then evaporate it at higher pressures as well. And looking into to the energy balances of this, there are 2 diagrams, and if you focus on the one on your left, you'll see the 3 cases. That's the 3 columns. The base case, which was simple compression, then you have the cryogenic liquid route and the cryogenic solid route. The green part here is the energy consumption in the electrolyzer stack. The red and the blue parts are minimum required utilities, hot and cold, in this system. I haven't done heat integration, so I haven't sort of synthesized the heat exchange network here, but this is from a pinch analysis, so this shows the minimum required utilities. And then there is a small yellow contribution, which is compressions and pumps. And what you see here is that there is not a whole lot of difference. If we subtract the delta H, you can look on your right here, so that's sort of the differences between the 3 cases, and you see that they are very similar, and actually that the compression seems to be the one that comes out the best. And one of the reasons for this, and I'm sure that there are many, but one of them is that when we compress, we are not, we have had some efficiency losses. They come out as heat, and as we're heating up the CO2 afterwards, at least in the model, that heat is not actually a huge problem here. So that's one of the reasons why the base case comes out like this. In order to see if this picture actually is the right picture, we'll keep it there. So we'll start somewhere in the middle. further heat integration is needed, and that's what I'm working on. So for conclusions, first, there are problematic impurities in the various air capture, or coming off the various air capture techniques. They can be filtered out, or they can be selected out by selecting the right materials for the systems. Also, there are different alternatives to simple compression, but further analysis is needed to see if there is actually something to gain here. One thing that was important was that this compression step is a very, very small part of the overall energy consumption of this process. So it remains to be seen if this is actually a very important thing to minimize. But again, small minimizations could be what puts us in or out of business here. And then finally, we're looking into other compression techniques based on sorbents, just like we use the sorbents in the air capture to go from 400 ppm to atmospheric pressure. You could imagine that you could use a similar sorbent going from atmospheric pressure to 50 atmosphere if a sorbent that can do that could be found. And then the last thing to do is to integrate the model that I showed you with a fuel synthesis to look at the overall economics. So yeah, that's it. I'd like to thank my co-workers and collaborators and sponsors.
Thank you. Thank you, Søren. Søren actually beat his time by 5 minutes. That doesn't mean you get extra time, John. You're up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure being here. I've been asked to talk about methanol synthesis from CO2, and it's fortunate that the chairman believes this is the best chemical. I have a different opinion. It's actually dimethyl ether, but we can make dimethyl ether from... One simple dehydration step. Yeah, or we can make it in a combined, but we can talk about that later. Well, I'll start with a few qualifying statements. I'm working, and I have been working for this gentleman Dr. Haldor Topsøe for almost 40 years. Unfortunately, he passed away last year, 4 days before his 100th birthday. But he was a guy with long-ranging visions, and that's why he was also very interested in this subject, in fact. But he founded the company I'm working for, and we are around 2,700 employees working worldwide, and we generate around 700 million euros revenue. And what we do is basically all based on surface science, and it's more specifically into heterogeneous catalysis, both catalysis and the technology around it, building plants and developing new processes and so forth. And of course, I could also have talked about methanation. I could have talked about biogas upgrading. We have a project here on 50 kilowatt upgrading of biogas by means of solid oxide electrolysis. I could also have talked about DME. But methanol is, I agree with the chairman, it's a really good example of generating a renewable fuel, because from methanol you can make almost everything. You could also make, alluding to what the speakers said this morning, we could make fibers, we could make all the plastics we normally make, more or less. We could also even make food. We could feed bacteria with methanol if we wanted to do that. I recall that was done in the 70s. But apart from our business, which we live off, and I would say that we are one of the leading suppliers of catalytic technology for a lot of technologies, hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, synthetic natural gas or substitute natural gas. We also are the proud owner of a fuel cell company, Topsøe Fuel Cell, which is around 100 people, which have been at it for 10 years. And before that, we had an extensive collaboration with Risø for the solid oxide fuel cell technology, ranging back into the 80s. Okay, now getting into methanol synthesis. I've worked with that for almost my entire professional career, and it seems very simple. but it's only on the surface. It's in fact rather complicated. The more you learn about it, the more complicated it seems. But I'll try to give you a rundown of what I believe is the truth. First of all, you can make it from either CO or CO2. But there's a consensus now that the synthesis in itself on the normal synthesis catalyst, which is a copper-based one, is taking place directly from CO2. But there's more to it than that, because the copper catalyst, which is actually the heart of the whole thing, is a very dynamic animal. It changes shape, morphology, and so on, depending on the gas composition you throw at it. It is the metallic copper which is active, but it spreads out when you have a reducing gas, so you get more active sites for your synthesis. So it's one of the few examples of where the normal law in reaction kinetics that the number of active sites are constant do not hold true. You have to take that into account when evaluating the rate of the synthesis. And this is also borne out in these curves, where you see the carbon conversion as a function of a stoichiometric methanol synthesis gas. And back in the 80s, the group at Clear's group found that the optimum composition with respect to reaction rate is around 2 or 3% CO2. I repeated those experiments with a very interesting synthesis. I do not have time to go into details around, but again, I found a optimum around 2 or 3% CO2. Another fact is that and perhaps I should add that the reason for this is that the methanol is synthesis from CO2, but as you increase the amount of CO2 in your synthesis gas, you get more and more water in your product gas, and water absorbs competitively on the copper and thus decrease the reaction rate. So you have this optimum around 2 or 3%. Furthermore, the rate of degradation of the catalytic activity is also a function of the synthesis gas. So if you have a very CO2-rich gas, you get a lot of water, and you get degradation due to the presence of steam in your synthesis gas. Whereas if you have a more CO-rich gas, you get a drier gas, and the copper sintering and other degradation phenomena are slowed down. This will making methanol from CO2, there's been written a lot about it lately, but actually it's an old thing. When I started in the R&D division of Topsøe, that was my first assignment, was to make methanol from CO2, and that was back in '79. But we also do it on a commercial scale today, because almost all methanol worldwide are made from natural gas. But if you start with methane, you don't get a stoichiometric gas. So it pays off to add some CO2 so you get a more balanced synthesis gas. And you can do that by doing reverse shift within a steam reformer. Here you see a picture of 2 of those from the actual plant, where we take CO2 from a nearby ammonia plant and add it to the natural gas, and thus boost the production capacity. These 2 streams could also be renewable methane, like we talked about. We have the process for that. And an interesting thing I don't have time to get into is if we gather all these small producers of biogas, for instance, they are far too small to make economic methanol production. But we could gather it in the natural gas grids and build then larger methanol plants, where we could also take the benefit of getting district heating from these plants and build them in normal commercial sizes. So I tend to disagree a little bit with all this. I think we should generate the syngas or the constituents or the feedstocks for the methanol decentralized, but then perhaps build bigger commercial sized unit close to city centers, because these plants are non-polluting and so on. That's just a thought. Okay, we have looked into 2 different ways of integrating solid oxide electrolyzers into methanol production. One of them is by wood gasification, and that is also a presentation in itself. You have to remove different substances, tars, sulfur, and so on. We know how to do that and have demonstrated it. And then you can make methanol. If you do that, you also need to adjust your synthesis gas composition, because biomass is fundamentally CH2O, roughly. So there's too little hydrogen in the biomass to turn it into methanol. So what you see here is what we do is we add oxygen to the gasifier to get the conversion going. Then we remove all the impurities, the tars and so on, and then we do water gas shift in order to get more hydrogen, and then we throw away a lot of CO2, biogenic CO2. Because remember, the trees have done Klaus's job a little slower perhaps, but they have removed CO2 from the atmosphere. And now we throw it away again. 700 tons if you have a 1,000 ton dry wood based plant. And you'll make 520 tons of methanol out of this. If you now add a solid oxide electrolyzer, just producing hydrogen, then you see the mass streams here. The hydrogen stream is not very prominent because we're talking kilos here, but in energy terms it's quite significant. And now we can convert all the carbon in the feedstock. So we double the methanol output. We make 1,050 tons per day of methanol. And we also generate 750 tons of oxygen, and I can use 1/3 of that for the gasifier and throw away the oxygen plant. Except if I have to rely, as alluded to by Christian, on fluctuating electricity prices, so I don't get low prices all the time. Then I'll have to design the plant for, say, minimum 1/3 solid oxide electrolyzer in order to provide the oxygen. I don't know what to do with the rest of the oxygen, but that's another story. At least it's not harmful for the atmosphere as far as I can see. But if you compare the efficiencies of these two routes, you can also see we can transform dry wood into methanol with roughly 60% efficiency, and we get some district heat, which is very important, at least in Scandinavia. And it counts, although it's, the exergy is not that prominent, people really pay for it, and the alternative is to burn other stuff. But if you prefer second law efficiencies, then the solid oxide alternative is also quite prominent. But even in lower heating value terms, we get a very nice efficiency around 71%. Of course, this is cheating a little bit because electricity is pure exergy, but nevertheless, you get a good energy conversion efficiency. Okay, I'll end up with what this conference is all about, as I hear it, is utilization of CO2 from the atmosphere. And I've studied a case where we start with water, CO2, and electricity. And there you can either operate the solid oxide electrolyzers at pressure, or you can send different amounts of CO2 through the solid oxide electrolyzer, different amount of co-electrolysis. I believe that is the most important or the most efficient way of doing it instead of doing reverse shift outside the loop. And if you calculate using all these models I've talked about, our kinetic models and so on, heat and energy balance, you also realize that this synergy Christian mentioned, that we generate the steam we need for the solid oxide electrolyzer. We generate that in the methanol synthesis. That's very important. But the net effect is that if you plot the amount of methanol synthesis reactor volume you need to invest in as function of the amount of CO2 you send through the solid oxide electrolyzer, you see that the amount of catalyst diminishes quite substantially due to both kinetics, thermodynamics, and degradation issues. On the other hand, the byproducts, the ethanol and other byproducts in methanol goes up. If it's for fuel use, it doesn't matter. If it's for chemical use, it has a cost. So the optimum is probably around 80% co-electrolysis. The bottom line is that is it beneficial to pressurize the stacks or not? It is indeed Because first of all, if you pressurize them, you throw away your synthesis gas compressor, which is a quite substantial investment. And furthermore, you get a better efficiency. Alluding to Søren's presentation, the energy invested in compressing the CO2 is very minor. It doesn't really matter. So it's only 2% of the total energy efficiency. And the overall efficiency of the whole conversion from electricity to lower heating value in methanol is very high, around 80% if you pressurize the stacks, which is a very wise utilization of renewable energy. And if you add the district heating you could also get, it would be a very efficient process. So to end up and not aggravate the timekeeper, I would like to conclude that we can do it, we can build those plants today. We know how to build these methanol plants. That would be a piece of cake. We can supply them to you tomorrow if you want. What's lacking is the solid oxide electrolyzer, especially the pressurized ones. And of course, a cheap way to get the CO2. Because pressurizing would give us a better economy and better energy conversion efficiency. Another pertinent point, in my opinion, is that until the air capture is ready on a large scale, I think we have to rely on the bioconversion routes, because that's an alternative way of CO2 capture. But as Mogens also said this morning, biomass availability is marginal, or not marginal, but it's very limited, perhaps 100, 200 ethajoule per year globally. But if we combine them with the solid oxide electrolyzer or other electrolyzer technologies, we can double or triple the bio potential. And that's an important point, because I think that will be the starting point for implementing this type of technologies. And with that, I thank you for your attention.